Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Precise ELT Seminar 2015, titled Precise Writing Comes Naturally with a Communicative Grammar. Precise Publications have the pleasure in launching their second edition of Precise Communicative Grammar for HKDSE English. I would like to thank you all for joining Precise Publications today. It is a pleasure to have you all here. Today we have three wonderful speakers who will be speaking around the HKDSE English curriculum, which I hear is rather tricky these days. So our first speaker is Mr. Paul Paskowitz. He will be speaking about the vocabulary level and the vocabulary gap in HKDSE. Mr. Paul Paskowitz is the author of Combination for the HKDSE Reading Paper 1 Vocabulary Workout. He has over 20 years experience teaching English in Hong Kong, not only in upper secondary, but also in universities, business, and in government. Paul also provides writing courses and workshops for government departments. Our second speaker is Mrs. Nishita Prasad. Mrs. Prasad will be speaking about the HKDSE reading paper Made Easy, and I hear it's rather difficult, so this will be something to listen to. Mrs. Prasad has been a teacher for over 25 years and is the English panel chairperson of the St. Francis Canossian College. Our final speaker for the day is Mr. John Duncan, who will be speaking after the tea break on grammar form and grammar function, getting it right for HKDSE. Mr. John Duncan is co-author of the newly revised Precise Communicative Grammar for HKDSE English. In addition to this newly revised book, Mr. John Duncan has authored many books, including Distinction for HKDSE English All-in-One Exam Practice, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. I am sure you know all of his books and have used them in all your schools. As I mentioned earlier, there will be a tea break. We all love a good tea break. This will happen at 10:45 till 11:25. And I'm told that you have some rather delicious treats to keep you going until lunchtime. So bear with us till the tea break. Once again, thank you very much for joining Precise Publications today. And it gives me great pleasure to present our first speaker, Mr. Paul Paskowitz.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Today I'm going to talk about vocabulary in general, but particularly the vocabulary gap that Hong Kong students have to deal with in dealing with the HKDSE English paper and in preparing for university. Next slide. This is basically an outline of what I'd like to talk about. I don't know which one to focus on. Let's focus on this one. First of all, I want to talk about how many words your students know. We're going to talk about that and how we can find out. We're going to talk about how many words they need to know to do well in the HKDSE paper, to do well at university, to do well in their other academic subjects. We are going to look at which words they need to know, because we're talking about 20,000 words. Our students know between 2,000 and 3,000 of those words. So which ones should we focus on to try to close the vocabulary gap? Next, where can they meet these new words? Can they meet them at random? Can they meet them through reading, active reading, or other approaches? Sorry, can we go back? Back. Maybe don't follow my hand signals because I'm a bit awkward with my hand signals. I'll tell you when to move. Finally, how can you test what they know, what they need to know, how much progress they're making, and so forth? So that's basically an outline of what I'm going to cover in the next 35 minutes. So next slide, please. First, how many words do your students know? I've had, let's move to the next slide again. I've had quite a bit of difficulty, next slide please. I've had quite a bit of difficulty finding good information on how many words our secondary school students know in Hong Kong. Most of the research that's available is done by university researchers on university students because, you know, They need to do the research, they need to get published to get a promotion and so forth. There isn't that same incentive in secondary schools. So it's a bit frustrating trying to find out exactly where we stand at different levels of secondary school. I've got 3 studies here, probably the 3 best known studies. Unfortunately, 2 out of the 3 are of university students, only 1 of them secondary school students. The first one is secondary. This researcher studied 449 students. Sorry, this is not secondary, it's primary and secondary. So it's rather a small sample, you know, for 4 different levels. She studied primary 3 and 5, secondary 1 and 3, both EMI schools and CMI schools. So there's quite a range for just 400 odd students. Still, it's all we've got, so let's take a look at what she found out. First of all, she used the nation tests in the Lex 500 word test. We'll take a look at that towards the end of the talk this morning to see what these tests involve. Next slide, please. Now, this is what she found. Primary students had a vocabulary of only about 925 words. Secondary 3 students had a vocabulary of about 2,891 words, which at first glance looks pretty good. Especially since the next study we look at of year 1 Chinese university students shows about the same vocabulary level. But it's a bit inconsistent because we find that just over half of those subjects could not even reach the basic 2,000 word level. So this is where the challenge is for us. So the other finding that probably is a bit understandable, CMI students had about half the vocabulary of EMI students. Okay, next slide, please. This just sort of concludes the most interesting findings were that even at the secondary 3 level, after students have studied English for 12,500 hours, they still need help with the basic 2,000 words. So the acquisition of vocabulary at lower secondary doesn't seem to be that efficient yet. So next slide, please. The second study was, this I think is probably the best known study of vocabulary in Hong Kong students, but it's a Chinese university. It's not secondary level, but we can get something from it. First of all, the study was done in 2005, so that was when we still had Form 7. So students had an extra year of secondary school. Still, they knew fewer than half the words at the 3,000 level. So from the 0 to 2,000 word level, they knew most of those words. But from the 2,000 to 3,000 word level, we're talking the frequency level, the most frequent words in English, they knew less than half. Or, sorry, yeah, fewer than half at that 3K level. So that's why you often hear the statistic that first-year university students have a vocabulary of less than 3,000 words. So it's rather grim when you look at the fact that they're studying textbooks that were written for native speakers, and native speakers at that level have a vocabulary of between 15 and 20,000 words. So, you know, 1/8 to 1/10 of the vocabulary they need to study these subjects in Form 6 and university. So that's a bit depressing. The fact that they only knew 8% of the words at the 10,000 word level is not so critical, because the words at that level, that will be, you know, sort of 1 to 2% of the words they encounter. It's not that important compared to the words at the 2,000 word level and the 3,000 word level. The 2,000 word level, that's 87% of the words that they're going to encounter. The 3,000 word level added to that, we're getting up over 92%, even, yeah, about 92% according to Poll Nation. So let's, next slide, please. Back a little bit. One. Yeah, here we are. The third study was of CityU students, involved CityU students. But here's the problem with this study. They were students in the Department of Language Studies. Now, I've taught at City University for 20 years, and the last 5 years has been students in the Department of Language Studies. And these students are majoring in English language because they're good at English language. These are students that at the time of, we had A-levels as the final exam, we're getting A's and B's. Most of the students in my courses in the last 5 years had A and B. So we're talking at very high level. These students, when you hear them speak, they're basically like native speakers. Tremendous vocabulary, tremendous speed and fluency. They're extremely impressive in English. So this is not a good way to judge university students at City University. I've taught engineering students, computer science students, accounting students, marketing students, and so forth. None of them come close to the students that are majoring in English language. However, even these students, okay, they knew all of the 2,000 word level, and the 3,000 level they knew 91%, which is, not that far, I guess, away from native speaker level. But at the 5,000 word level, only 64%. And the university word list, this is a list of 580 words that I guess most researchers agree, once your students know the first 2,000 words, this is the next most important word group to learn, the university word list. Because it, whereas the first 1,000 words makes up about 80% or whatever of the average text. The next 1,000 words makes up about 7 or 8%. Some studies say 10%. The university word list, now it's the academic word list. It's a bit shorter. It makes up about 8% of the average text people will read, whether it's newspapers, magazines, academic texts, doesn't matter which subject. So this is a very, very important list. They knew 72% of this list. So this looks good, this looks impressive. But remember, these are students who got A's and B's in A-level English. So we expect them to be a very high level. Next slide, please. So the conclusion, this gives these students control over 90% of the words they encounter in general reading. But this is still far from the 95% that most experts say students need to be able to understand a text comfortably. Some researchers say they need 98%. They need to know 98% of the vocabulary to be able to read a text comfortably. So we're talking about the top students from A-level and university. And even they have not yet reached the level where they can read average texts comfortably. Next slide, please. So how many words do your students need to know? Well, we've already found out that even secondary 3 students need help for the first 2,000 words. These are my conclusions. What have we found out? We need more research on this. I've given you one study on secondary school students. I did read another one. I didn't have room to put it on here today. A University of Hong Kong master's thesis in 2002. This researcher studied about 400 secondary school students at what that time was band 4 or 5 school. And he found that the students were basically learning 100 words a year between secondary 1 and secondary 3. Native speakers of English are learning 1,000 words a year at that level. So the gap is quite enormous. Anyway, I think it's a great opportunity for action research in Hong Kong schools. We need more data at all levels of secondary school and all levels of ability. And I just think it's a great opportunity for teachers to get involved in research. Next slide, please. So how many words do your students need to know? Well, this is where we get to the frequency lists. There's no possible way our students can learn 2,000 words a year through secondary school, which they would need to keep up with native speakers of English. That's just not possible. So what should we focus on to make our use of time most efficient? Next slide, please. Here is just an analysis of the vocabulary level of the reading papers in the last 2 years. In 2013, this is using the Flesch Reading Ease test. I think you can do this in Microsoft Word, but I found it wasn't, maybe I didn't do it properly. It didn't appear to be that accurate, so I used an online system. But here's what I found out. The higher the score, the easier the material is to read. In 2013, this may be a surprise to you, because many people find the 2014 reading paper more difficult than the 2013. But look at the reading level. 2013, the reading level was extremely difficult. That would be basically material written at the level of a 16 to 20-year-old native English-speaking student. Now a 16 to 20-year-old native-speaking student has a vocabulary of about 16 to 20,000 words. Our students have a vocabulary of 2,000 to 3,000 words. Yet they're expected to read material at a much, much higher level. Look at 2014. This really surprised me. 2014, the reading level was much, much easier in terms of vocabulary load. You can see 65, let's say 79 to 85, that's the level of a 12-year-old. So that would be a student with a vocabulary of, let's say, 12 to 15,000, or sorry, about 12,000 words. So there's quite a huge difference in the readability between the 2 years. But if we look at the actual results, we find that aside from text 1, the questions associated with text 1, if you look at the examiner's report, the grades were roughly the same between the two. Text 1, the mark was much higher in 2014. I think it was, the average score was 65%. Compared to about 52% or so in 2013. But the other papers, it was roughly equal. So despite the huge disparity in reading ease between the 2 years, the scores were relatively the same. So the question is, why? And I don't have the complete answer, but I think Nishita will be able to explain part of that in her talk. I've just looked at vocabulary. If we move to the next slide. Okay, well, I analyzed the vocabulary of the passages in both years using these other readability formulas. They're the opposite. The higher the level, the more difficult it is. The first one I showed you, they base it on age. But these formulas, they base on grade level. So grade level of native speakers. So if it's at a level of 11, that would be a comfortable reading material for a student in grade 11 in the US or Canada, which would be Form 6, Secondary 6 here. So these are the ones I used. I used these 5 because if you use one, it's not very consistent. But if you take all 5 and you take the average, it's probably more reasonable, more accurate. So next slide. This is how it worked out. You can see the problem if I use just the SMOG index, for example. There's a considerable difference between that and the Gunning index. I can't get into the details of the difference between them because I've forgotten, but it has to do with, some of them deal with number of words compared to the number, per sentence, some number of syllables, some the length of syllables, and so forth. So in the end, there's such a difference between some of them, I thought it would be better to take the average. So this is what I want to focus on, the average. In 2013, the average grade level for the vocabulary in these papers was between 11 and 13. So grade 11, those students would have a vocabulary, native English speakers would have a vocabulary of about 17,000 words. For 13, that would be closer to 18 or 19,000 words. Again, our students are trying to handle the same passage with a vocabulary of, say, 2,000 to 3,000 words. Huge difference. So next slide. Oh, sorry. No, go back. Yeah. This is again, this contrast between the 2 years I found fascinating. Almost like they had a different writer this year or something. Grade 11 to 13 level in 2013, and from grade 5 to 9 level in 2014. Huge difference. But what makes it even more confusing is that the results were roughly the same in the 2 years. So does reading level make a difference? I don't know. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, well, never mind. I got the slides a little bit mixed up. Just for example, I want to cover several researchers and what they say about readability levels and native English speakers, what it means about their vocabulary. Let's take a grade 1 student, age 6 to 7. He, according to this researcher, I don't know if it's Bimiller or B-Miller. Anyway, he's a very well-respected vocabulary researcher from the University of Toronto. So he studies Canadian and American students' vocabulary levels. And he says at primary 1 level, basically, a native speaker has a cumulative vocabulary of about 5,000 words. And he says, as a rule, or Nation says, as a rule of thumb, from then on, throughout the school years, native speakers add about 1,000 words a year. So a student at, say, grade 12 level, if you add 12,000 words to 5, you've got 17,000 words. So that's the vocabulary level that these texts are written for. Next slide, please. Back, yeah. So here's another researcher, Paul Nation. Now he's from New Zealand. So I don't know if his research was done in New Zealand, but almost certainly it was. His is a little bit different. This is the age of a primary 1 student, and he says their average vocabulary is 2,500 words, compared with the 4,000 or 5,000 words for the Canadian researcher. I cannot explain that difference, but it's just important to look at a variety of research to get a better feel for how our students compare to native speakers. So look at the age of 18. Now this would be grade 12, basically. Students have, according to Nation, have an average vocabulary of 17,600 words. So, about 8 times what our average students have. And yet our students are expected to read material written for that level of 17,000 word vocabulary. Next slide, please. I just included some other research for general reference. This researcher says that high school students have a vocabulary of 40,000 words, but this includes derivatives, so that would be more like 15,000 to 20,000 words. This one found the same 50,000 words, let's say roughly 20,000 base words. This researcher found 75,000 native speakers at high school level had a vocabulary of 75,000 words. That would, let's say, be about 25,000 word families, and the rest derivatives. But so quite a difference between them. Here's one more by Golden Nation and Reed. They found the average university student had a vocabulary of about 17,000 words, compared to those Chinese university first-year students who had a vocabulary of something less than 3,000 words. Next slide, please. So here I am with my summary again of the reading levels, but this time I've added native speaker vocabulary at this grade level, and I've added Hong Kong vocabulary, so we can take a closer look. So to read the texts in 2013, the 4 texts, they're written for students with a vocabulary of 16,000 to 18,000 words. In 2014, they're written for students with a vocabulary of 11,000 to 15,000 words. So even in 2014, with the significant, difference in readability level, still the vocabulary level needed to read this material comfortably is many times more than our students have, 2,000 to 3,000. So next slide, please. Nishita could probably explain all of this better. I was interested to know why, given the extreme difference between the 2013 and 14 papers in the level of vocabulary, why was the average grade roughly the same? And I'm wondering if maybe this is part of the reason. In 2013, the average frequency level of the vocabulary tested in a reading paper, of course they test many other things, but they test a knowledge of vocabulary as well. The average frequency level of the words tested was 11,000, the 11,000 level. So the 11,000 most frequent words, which we would never expect our students to know. It would be quite rare. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, when you look at these words, do you think your students would recognize them? I'm probably not, unless we had taught them, ways of using the context and affixes and so forth to determine the meaning of words. But look at the difference. In 2014, much easier texts in terms of readability, but the actual frequency level of the words tested was much higher, the 14,000 word level. So there were more words tested in 2014, according to my quick survey, and the words were at quite a higher level of frequency. So in other words, rarer and even less, I guess almost impossible that our students would encounter these words, more than once or twice in their life. And two of the words were so infrequent that they weren't even on the list that I used. Whereas in 2013, there was only one word that wasn't on the list that I had used. So in fact, the difference is probably even higher. So anyway, this perhaps explains part of why, despite the difference in reading levels, the scores were roughly the same. Next. Please. So I've gone back to this summary table again, but I've added just a few more rows here. One, I decided to compare the number of words, almost exactly the same. Between 2013 and 14, a difference of 8 words. So the exam authority appears to be quite precise in this regard, at least. A number of questions, again, almost identical year by year. But the mean scores, this is what I was interested in. At the back of the past papers book, they give the mean scores, and you can see the first text, the score was much higher in 2014, which I would expect given the difference in vocabulary level. However, in the other texts, roughly the same, despite the difference in vocabulary level. I attribute that to the tougher questions. It's the only explanation. Certainly, as we can see, the vocabulary tested was tougher. I don't know about the other questions. Nishita could probably explain that more. Next, please. So anyway, what can we conclude? How many words do students need to know? Even at the secondary 3 level, they still need help with the first 2,000 words. These are worth spending time on, no question about it. They cannot, handle the HKDSE or university study without knowing these words. And again, we need more research because we just don't know enough. Next slide, please. Which words do our students know? Well, I've already gone over some of this, but next slide, please. Anyway, okay. High frequency words, this is the first 2,000 most frequent words in English. They generally make up about 80% of the words that a student will encounter in any text, academic, newspaper, whatever. Academic word list is the next most, as I mentioned earlier, is the next most important level. It accounts, okay, it's 580 words, but it accounts for 8% of the words student will encounter. And since they'll be studying academic work at university, and many of them studying in English, they're at upper secondary, they absolutely need to know these words. Technical words, 3%. These are words that they will learn in their academic subjects if they're studying them in English. This is not necessarily your problem. Low frequency words, only 2%. So it's just not worth spending time on those low frequency words that they're testing in the HKDSE. For 2% to study 15,000 words, it's just completely random. Next, please. Nation says for 98% coverage, which he says they need to be able to understand a text without going to a dictionary or whatever, they need an 8,000 to 9,000 vocabulary for written and 6 to 7 for spoken. Next slide, please. This just shows the difference between written coverage and spoken coverage. The high frequency words, of course, are used more in spoken. So I just put this here for your reference. However, this is what Nation, probably the most respected researcher in vocabulary, keeps harping on. The most frequent 2,000 words, along with the academic word list, 580 words, along with proper nouns, names, and so forth, that gives 95% coverage. That's pretty good. That's, knowing how to use context to determine meaning, knowing how to, understanding affixes and so forth. These, extra sort of things that we can teach students can help them reach maybe the 98% level with not that big a vocabulary. Next slide, please. So Nation, he argues again that direct teaching is justified only for high frequency words, for the academic words list, and other specialized vocabulary, which isn't your problem. They're going to learn that vocabulary in their academic subjects. And generally, it's my experience, because I have done vocabulary studies in chemistry and geography, and I have found that the students have very, very good handle on the specialist vocabulary used in their subjects at the Form 6 level. In fact, not just knowledge of the vocabulary, but knowledge of how to use it properly. It's quite impressive. But the other thing I really like about the academic word list is that this sort of this makes the English department of a school, actively promoting English across a curriculum, because these words are these are the words that are most commonly used in academic study. It does right across the spectrum, from science to the arts and so forth. So by focusing on these words, you're not just helping your students with DSE exams and preparing them for university, you're helping them, in the other subjects and showing the subject teachers that you're there for them, you're working together. So I think it's something that really needs to be looked at. And there's so many amazing resources on the internet to help you. My favorite by far is Oxford, the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary. They have the advanced academic word list. You just click on the word, they give you definitions, examples, and so forth. The only thing they don't give you are quizzes and practice with the academic words list. But, I mean, it's such a wonderful resource and completely free and well-organized and so forth. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Vocabulary gap in the HKDSE writing paper. I've already talked about that quite a bit, but let's move on a bit. I just have a couple of slides. Here I did an analysis of what percentage of the text is the first 1,000 words, what percentage of the text is the second 1,000, what percentage is the academic word list, and what percentage is others. And usually the first 2,000 words is higher, it's up to 87%. But the vocabulary in these papers is so difficult that it was only 76%. However, part of that is because there are so many proper nouns used in a lot of these passages. Chinese names, even the words like Chinese is not among the most frequent 2,000 words, but we know all of our students understand the word. Knowing the name of a leader of the Premier of China or something like that, or rather not knowing that name it makes no difference whether you're a native speaker or you have a vocabulary of 1,500 words. So this is not necessarily that accurate. This was very interesting. The academic word list usually only adds about, is equivalent to 8% of the words in any text you meet, but here it was 11% in 2013. Again, emphasizing that studying the academic word list is well worth students' time. In 2013, text 4, a little bit different. The academic word list again was quite important. Next slide, please. This is 2014. Now here, the much lower, vocabulary level of readability, or higher level of readability, excuse me. The academic word list almost worthless in this case, in 4.4%. So that, reflects the higher readability of those texts. Okay, but anyway, next one. Okay, this may be very difficult for you to see at the back, but what I did was I used lextutor.com, just another wonderful internet resource if you want to determine, the readability of the texts and so forth, or which words to focus on. What they do is these different colors tell you what level. So the first most frequent 1,000 words are in brown. Of course, you would expect them to be most of the text. The second are the green. We would expect our students to know most of those. The academic word list, those are blue. Now, as you can see, in 2013, there were quite a few of them. But the most interesting is the red, because those are the ones that the exam authority likes to test, because those are the ones they don't expect our students to know. So they expect them to use contextual clues and so forth. But look, a lot of them aren't that difficult. They're simply proper nouns. Whether you're a native speaker or a Chinese speaker, doesn't matter when it comes to a word like, I don't even know how to pronounce it. How do you pronounce it? Is it the guzheng or anybody? Guzheng, yeah, okay. So I would it doesn't matter. You know it's a musical instrument, whether you're a native speaker. Chinese, proper name, the musical instrument again. So it's not as difficult as it looks. But of course, the exam authority chooses the more difficult ones to test usually. A word like this, they'll choose to test, which they don't expect local students to know. All right, next one, please. This is text 4 from 2013. Again, a very difficult text. So let's look at the red words, because those are the least frequent and the ones, again, they like to test. Some names, British, I guess most students would not have trouble with that. Dystopia, dystopian, they make it quite clear in the text what the word means. So although it looks bad, it's not, in the end, that difficult once they've read the text. But words like extinction, equivocate, delusions, yes, a lot of very, very difficult words in 2013. Next one, please. This is 2014. So now the reading level is 5.2, grade 5. So basically twice as easy as the 2013 text. And as you would expect, not many of the red words, above the 3,000 word level. But still, a lot of them quite easy to understand. American, British, schoolgirl, okay, it's not in the top 2,000 words, but school is and girl is, so together they are. Website, not on the 2,000 word list, but most students would be able to recognize it. So the actual number of difficult words is not that great, but the words that they tested tended to be the most difficult words in all the passages. That's the trick. Here again, you can tell when you see a word like television in red, this is the, I think I have to quit very soon. This is the, it's obvious they took this list from the general service list. This is a list that was written 70 years ago, but it's still very, very popular today. And it didn't have words like television, obviously. It didn't have words even like telephone, I don't think, in the top 2,000. Certainly didn't have words like computer and so forth. So you can see that this list is a little bit outdated. Anyway, I don't have time to go through that. Can we move ahead? Where can they meet the words? What I've included here, I understand that Precise gave you a handout. Next slide, please. I've just given you a list of the lists, of the word lists. I know it sounds terribly old-fashioned promoting word lists because this is what they did 50 years ago when learning languages, and this is what they did 100 years ago. But the research shows that these are the words that the students need most. Many people argue that, no, this is not useless because learning these words in isolation, you get a word, a verb, and you have a preposition, you put them together as a phrasal verb, and of course the meaning is completely unrelated to the two individual words. So, of course, if you're going to teach these words, you need to teach collocations, you need to teach phrases that they're used in, you need to teach phrasal verbs and so forth. I think that's understood. But I've already talked about, this is the nation list. He's got 14, this is a more updated list from his previous list. He's got 14 1,000 level lists, and he uses the British National Corpus, which is about 100 million words. So it's pretty accurate. The problem is, among the most frequent words tend to be a lot of British words like, Queen and Prince and Parliament and Conservative Party and things like that that are not very relevant to Hong Kong students necessarily, unless they're studying history or something. Another one, very, very good, if you want to do a quick search of the frequency level of a word, you're not sure whether to teach it or not, go in here, plug it in, and it'll tell you if it's the 1700th most frequent or the 17,000. Great resource. Next one. The general service list, I told you this one is 70 years old, but it's still very popular. The problem is, I just went through it quickly, and I found these words that have to be removed. They may have been within the top 2,000 words 70 years ago, but they certainly aren't now. They're not even close to it. So those, for example, words have to be removed, but any English teacher can quickly, in about 5 minutes, go through this list and decide which words are not suitable for their students. Next slide, please. I'm saying those words should be removed and replaced by words like computer, phone, TV, video, perhaps classroom language, perhaps classroom objects, and so forth. Next slide, please. Here's another list by C-Word. I've put the links at the back on the final slide. They have the first the 4,000 most frequent words in English. They did this for the US Department of Education. Another one is the Hong Kong Education, well, I put AMB. It was the EMB when they devised this list. I think they got the Chinese university to devise this list for them. It's good because it's based on this 70-year-old list, but they removed all the outdated words. The only problem is that they added a lot of words, like animal names, which aren't really that useful for students when they're preparing for the HKDSE or university. So I think that's unfortunate. Next one. The British National Corpus, this is a wonderful resource as well. As I said, 100 million words. You can do a frequency search and so forth. You can print out the lists and so forth. This is another one I don't think many people pay attention to, but the Co-Build Dictionary is a great resource. They use the 5-star system. So the five stars are the 680 most common, frequently used words in English and so forth. I think it's a great resource, at least for the first 2 levels, for the 1,700 most frequent words. Next slide, please. The academic word list, this is extremely important, as I mentioned. I took this from the Oxford. If you go to an Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, this is how they introduce it. So I just put it there for your reference. Next one. Oh, sorry, I did put the Oxford link here. I don't know if you can see it, but just Google Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary and go to lists at the top, and that'll take you to the AWL. And again, great resource. Next, please. This is the Oxford 3000. Also, if you go to the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary and you go to lists at the top, they'll take you to the most frequent 3,000 words according to Oxford. Another great resource because excuse me, you could just click on the word and you get the definition, you get sentence examples and so forth. Next one, please. Yeah, I'm just saying teaching approaches. I don't have time to go into that obviously today, but one is focusing on affixes. Look at the word nation alone and how many prefixes and suffixes can be used with it to produce so many words. So I think every Hong Kong teacher knows and appreciates the value of teaching prefixes and suffixes and so forth. Next one. Other strategies, I just write these down for your reference, but we don't have time to talk about them today. Next one, how can you test to see what they know? Next. Next, don't have time. There's various types of tests. One is productive tests, one is, and the others are recognition tests. I've just included a few examples in the handouts. Next, please. Here's an example of what they call productive tests. They give the first couple of letters of a word without giving too much of a hint to see if they can fill in the rest of the word. And this is, to determine their level, 1,000 word, 2,000 word, 3,000 word. So this is the 2,000 word level. Next one, again 2,000 word level. Next one, 3,000 word level. Next one, back. Yeah. University word list, again, almost the same as the academic word list, but more words. The university word list was devised around 1990 by Paul Nation, University of Wellington or whatever it is, I forget. But then it was replaced in the mid-90s, I think, by the academic word list, a shorter, more compact list. But both useful. Next one, please. This is the 3,000 most frequent words, productive level. Next, 5,000. Next. This is, now we move to recognition type tests. This is one type. You look at, this one is little, okay? And you write true, not true, or don't know. Those are the three types. So that's one type. Next one. Go ahead, next one. Next. This is the most popular one, done by Paul Nation. Again, a recognition test, not a productive test. They give you 6 words here and 3 synonyms, basically, and you have to match them. Next one, there's actually 6 sets of 6 in each test. That's how that works. Next one, this is the university word list. Again, you could try it and see how comfortable you are with the vocab. Next one. The 3,000 word level, same. Next one, 5,000 word level, next. 10,000 word level, next. Now this is a different type. They give you a sentence and you have to decide, replace the word in a sentence with one of the choices. Next one, this one tests phrases, phrasal verbs and so forth. Next one, again, replacing one word with a synonym. Next one. Same thing, next one. This is one that I haven't tried, but it's a yes-no test where they have a lot of words that are meaningless and the student goes through ticking the ones that they know and so forth. I haven't tried it to see how reliable it is. Next one. Yeah, references. Okay, so I've gone over time. I'm very sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming today, and thank you for being such an attentive audience, and we'll move on to our next speaker.
Our next speaker is Mrs. Nishita Prasad, who will be speaking about the HKDSE reading paper Made Easy. Thank you.
The topic of my talk today is HKDSE reading paper Made Easy. Now, when I started preparing it, I did not see the 2015 paper, right? So, as you must have seen the 2015 paper, which we had on Monday, and you must have realized that the paper is difficult this year. It's more difficult than the other year's papers, right? So I'm trying my best to make it easy for you, but we have to work together. All right, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. Now, this is just a quick overview, which I have taken from the CDC Curriculum and Assessment Guide. Now, if you can see that wherever it's a broad range of text, it refers to Part A as well. Part A, and then B1 and B2. And then I quickly come down to complex texts, right? At the moment we have complex text, it refers to B2, right? And the exams authority, they are making it more and more complex, yeah? If you look at 2012 paper, and as it is progressing, what Paul said, if you look at the vocabulary overload, it's easier. But when it comes to question technique or questioning technique, we'll see that they're including a lot more open-ended questions where they need inferencing skills, and that is really difficult for our students, right? So, yeah, so B2, complex text. Otherwise, all these things are related to Part A as well as Part B. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, no. This one, exactly. So I'm going to analyze 4 papers, right? And then come at some common look at some common features, and then see how we are going to deal with these papers, right? So of course, in 2012, we had 4 texts altogether. We had newspaper, we had review, magazine. These are the ones based on popular culture, environmental conservation, social issues, etc., etc. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now let's look at this one over here. All that you see here in red, these ones over here, these are the short responses, right? So we have multiple choice questions, and then we have the short responses questions. And as you can see, B1, open-ended question 0. And that's the trend from the exams authority. B1, they do not give you open-ended, or they do not give students open-ended questions, but otherwise, this section is the major part of the paper. And then we have different kinds of questions, right? From multiple choice questions, short response including vocabulary, reference, open-ended, true, false, matching, text transfer, which is basically sentence completion, all right? And then we have sequencing or putting in chronological order, and then sentence completion. Sorry, this one is fill in the blank, basically. All right, next slide, please. Yeah. Now, this is the 2013 paper where we had from National Geographic, Terracotta Warriors, and then we had, that side we had dystopian literature, all right, on Hunger Games, okay? So they did try to include something which was relevant to the students, knowing that, or thinking that perhaps our students would know about Hunger Games. That was the whole rationale. Next slide. Yeah. Now, once again, we look at this, that we have short response section, and we have the variety over here. Yes, and then the same thing. Now, next slide, please. Yeah. Now, this is the 2014 paper, all right? And we have fiction they introduced for the first time, which was a short story, apologies all around, and then B1, of course, we had about the letters, and then celebrity, all right? Next slide. Yes, this is the one. Once again, we look at this, that this forms the major portion of the exam paper. Next. Yeah. Now, this is the latest paper, 2015 paper. And as you must have seen, I'm sure you've had a look at the paper, right? And again, even part A, the text was not really easy for them this year, all right? Part B1, very easy, very easy. It's a witness statement taken from, it's a sample statement from New South Wales government legal handout kind of a thing. And then the article, Young Minds in Critical Condition, very difficult because it was very unfamiliar for our students. Of course, I have not had time to speak to my students about the paper, But when I was looking at the paper, comparatively, I found that it is more difficult. All right, next slide. And of course, these are the question types. Now, if you can look at part B2, you can see that there are 7 questions for short response, open-ended, which carry 16 marks. And that's a lot, right? And these papers, these questions were really difficult, right? So okay, let's look at the next slide and then I talk about it. Yeah, now I'm comparing the trend for part A. Now here, I did not put 2012 because I did not have space to put 2012. But you can see that multiple choice, so they generally, the exams authority, they try to have almost the same number of, or the same percentage of question types, right? So here, again, short response to short response, open-ended. Now, this short response is, as you must be knowing, is quite simple. Quite simple in part A and part B1, but of course in part B2 they get very difficult. So of course this is part A, relatively easy. Next slide. B1, as you must have realized, B1 section is almost always easier than part A, all right? Because of course, as we know that we are capping the grade to level 4. So it's easier. Next slide. Yeah. Now let's look at this one. This is where it's becoming more and more difficult. Yeah? Each year, the question types are getting more and more difficult, and short response, open-ended. Earlier it was 3 question, 5 marks, then 4 question, 8 marks, and this year it's 7 question and 16 marks. 16 marks. And that is where students are really going to be, they must have been puzzled trying to do those. Otherwise, of course, the pattern remains the same. Next slide. Yeah, so again, let's look at the question types that we have to prepare our students for. So factual questions, very straightforward. Part A, part B1, part B2, no problem. Factual, direct question. Generally, B1 section has these factual questions. Our students generally will not have problems doing these factual questions. Vocabulary questions, which relate to words, phrases, figurative language. And when we talk about figurative language, we talk about simile, metaphor, personification. And of course, as you must be knowing, till 2015 or till this year, they have not given any poems. But if you remember, 2010 sample paper, there was a poem, all right? So gradually, I think they are moving towards it. Let's see, maybe next year, they'll have a poem. So now, language use, phrase, word, sentence, paragraph, conversation, etc. Sequencing, of course, we always have sequencing in our paper. Putting in order, chronological order, then justification, identifying positive or negative point of view. Reference, not really that difficult, but inference is quite difficult because students have to have the ability to read between the lines. So information which is not directly given to them, all right? It's there in the text, it's there implied, it's hidden, and then they have to try to decipher that. Themes and main idea can be a little tricky, but still it's easier than the inference questions. Next slide. All right. Now, if you look at the source of reading, I started from 2010, and we go straight till 2015, that we have a variety of texts, variety, all right? So I have actually given you all the source of reading material. So next. Yeah, and then there are reviews as well. Even this year, 2015 paper, we had this Tudor's book cover Implausible review taken from Wall Street Journal, all right? And here, of course, we have National Geographic, we have New York Times, we have Daily Beast, which used to be Newsweek, I think, earlier. Yeah, and then this is something new, witness statement. Of course, we did not really expect that there's going to be a witness statement. Of course, it's a sample witness statement. So what is interesting is that all these texts are authentic texts. authentics. And they've been taken from real magazines or articles. And in some of the articles, of course, they have revised the text to make it more exam-oriented, right? Next slide. Yeah, again, it's the text kind, or the text type. And for this year's paper, where they had that interview, right, of that person who's writing about Korea, there were also comments, online comments, all right? So that's also there. Next slide. Now, so points to note, this is really important. So like I mentioned earlier, so all the reading passages, they have been taken from authentic texts and they have been modified in some cases, all right? Next. Variety of text types. Next. Now, short response questions form a major share of the B2 section, all right? Like I've mentioned before, so 11 out of 20 questions in 2013 paper, 17 out of 25 in 2014 paper, and then 12 out of 22 in 2015 paper, all right? Now, B2 section of 2014 paper was more difficult than that of the previous year. So this was more difficult than 2013, and of course, B2 section of 2015 paper can be categorized as the most difficult paper so far. More to do because of the question types. They are moving towards more and more open-ended questions. Next. For the first time, a short story was used in part A of the 2014 paper. Apologies all around. And like I said, for the first time, they used this witness statement in this year's paper. So far, no poem has been used, although sample paper had it, but we have to think about that maybe they will have it next year. Next. There are questions on language devices, all right? And later on, I'll tell you why I'm focusing on this. Now, what metaphor does the writer use in paragraph 1? That's 2012 paper, and they generally come in B2, all right? Simile, B2, metaphor again in B2, metaphor in 2014, and irony in this year's 2015 paper, all right? And section A, generally they leave these things to B2, but they have actually started doing it in part A as well. So the most important thing is the level of difficulty in B2 section is increasing each year. So what do we do? That's the main thing. So let's see what we can do. Now we look at strategies. Now this is the most important thing for us. As English teachers, what are we going to do in school to help our students deal with this very difficult paper? Now, as you must have also, I particularly feel that for the HKDSC, the reading paper is the most difficult. I don't know what you have to think about it, or what you have to say about it. Because writing paper, we can teach the different genres of writing, right? We teach them a very structured approach, and we make them deconstruct, and then we teach them expressions, etc. And even for listening paper, like I was talking to John about it, it's quite teachable, because there's always a section where they tell you, or where they tell the students how to do the integrated tasks, right? And they just have to follow it, right? If they just follow it, they get the content, 9 out of 9. Maybe they will not get the language, but they'll get the content, right? But in this paper, what do? It's so broad. It's all out there, and they just have to. So the bottom line is context and exposure, right? We have to expose them to different kinds of text, a real variety, all right? And that we have to start doing at different levels. So at the school level, first of all, foster reading program through a DEAR program. Now, DEAR is drop everything and read, right? Do your schools have the DEAR program? Yeah? You must be having some kind of a reading program, maybe not called DEAR, right? And the ideal scenario would be if they could have 20 minutes per day. Even in my school, we do not have it 20 minutes per day. we only have it 2 times per cycle, which is not enough, right? So if panel heads are sitting here, and if you can go back to your principal and somehow try to convince your principal to give you, the English department, only 20 minutes of reading time, that will make a difference. Now, in your Dear Reading program, try to include a variety of text types, and also keep students away from book reports. You know, the moment we ask them to write book reports, their enthusiasm dies, right? Don't make them do book reports, all right? Keep them away from book reports. That's how they'll gradually start reading. I was going to say they'll start liking, but no, they would not like, but they'll read, all right? Next. Now, this is something for the junior form students. Have a newspaper reading program in the junior forms, perhaps just 1 day a week, all right? And make students do text-related tasks. That's what we do in our school, right? Form 1, 2, and 3, they order newspaper only on 1 day. And then we do different kinds of things related to the newspaper articles, right? And these are related to vocabulary, prepositions, different genres, short response, dictation, and then speaking. So it's not that they're doing the same thing every cycle or every week that they're writing a newspaper report. No. Here we just have to be a little bit creative in how we can do this, all right? So the level coordinators for each level, they decide that each teacher will be responsible for like 4 cycles or something like that, and then they would be preparing vocabulary-related items, worksheets for the students to do, or they're going to focus on prepositions. So the whole idea is that they're learning language in context. So let's look at and of course dictation as well, all right? That they read a page of the newspaper and they are going to get a dictation based on that page. Of course, teachers have to write, right? Okay, next slide. Now, benefits of the reading program. So they are exposed to different text types, that's the first thing. Secondly, they learn different kinds of vocabulary, all right? So they are learning language in context, and then they are becoming more aware of topical issues, both local and global, all right? So not only related to Hong Kong, but even otherwise, global issues. They become better speakers of English, right? Because you're also making them do a few oral tasks related to those newspaper articles. And ultimately, they become more confident. So it's all a question of becoming comfortable with the language. If they're comfortable with the language, they become more confident. And once they become more confident, they are more interested in the language. All right? Okay, next slide. Now, at the English department level, design a school-based integrated curriculum package. Now, it sounds very difficult, but actually it's not. You know, it's quite simple. Adopt a book, all right? Extract vocabulary from content. You can actually make students do all these things. Write dictations based on these words, right? And preferably on topical issues. So you have the context. You are taking some newspaper article or maybe a film or an Oscar movie or whatever, or parallel trading, etc. And then you write the dictation based on that. But at the same time, they have a content list of words, word list, right? And so they're studying that word list, and then you're giving them a dictation based on that word list. So it's always unseen dictation, but they have all those seen words over there. It's just that you are putting it in context, all right? So it's a little more hard work for teachers. Of course, we are always very hardworking. But you can use these every year for a few years. So it's just building up your own vocabulary bank, or you're building up your own school-based material, all right? Now, write quizzes based on related vocabulary. So not only dictation, so you're preparing dictations, but you're also preparing quizzes, all right? Link newspaper articles to the topics in question. So you have a chapter or a unit, all right? And then you also have newspaper articles related to that chapter, okay? Next. Now, at the English department level, this is something this is something really very useful because we have questions on poetic devices, right? It's a very good idea to make learning English through poems and songs a compulsory module, elective. If you can do this, this really helps because then you're killing two birds with one stone, right? You're teaching them an elective, but at the same time, you're teaching them how to do the reading paper. You know, so we are working towards making our students do the reading paper. So this is a very practical approach. This is the approach that we have in our school as well, all right? This is compulsory for us. And the other thing which I haven't put down over here is, again, if you could have the social issues elective as compulsory. Because then, again, you're making your students more aware of different issues, right? Include varied text types and make students aware of the different genres, right? Different article, blogs, reviews, and tell them what they are. So they are aware of this. Like sometimes in the question paper, there'll be a feature article, but actually it's just an article, all right? So make them aware of that. Again, vocabulary-related tasks for each test type. Okay, so always try to focus on the vocabulary from the text, and ultimately, the writing task is based on the reading passage, right? So they're recycling the vocabulary, right? And I think it's 9 exposure. 9 times they have to be exposed to a word to be able to internalize it, right? So the more they work on vocabulary, the better they are going to be at writing and also doing the reading paper in context. In context. Next, please. Now, in the English lesson, again, encourage the use of vocabulary learned from the reading passage in the module. Now, when students practice reading paper, this is just for the reading paper, ask them to underline words, expressions, sentences in the reading passage from where they source their answers. That means when they are doing the paper, when they're working out the answer, this is when you're teaching them, you know, how to do the paper, they underline the answers. So they are deconstructing the paper, actually. And then adopt a consolidated approach when practicing question types. That means if you're teaching them multiple choice questions, focus on just multiple choice questions. Or if you're teaching them open-ended question, which of course you will be teaching them right at the end, the last thing to do, teach them how to do it, right? And also, of course, we tell them that they will be penalized if they write wrong English, but in the real exam, actually they're not penalized. But don't tell them. All right, next. So deconstructing the paper. All right, next. Yeah, now, so I told you it should be context and exposure. So exposure is very important. So you can see I've given you a whole list of the articles and from where they have been taken. And you can see that many of them have been taken from South China Morning Post for obvious reasons. I think that must be the cheapest. All right, next. Yeah, here. So far, we've not had an advertisement or speech, etc., but we've had all the other kinds of writing. Next. Now, examination strategies. Tell your students that before they start answering the paper or answering the questions, they must read the whole text. They must read the whole text so that they have a feel of the whole context, and then they start answering. And they must answer open-ended questions in their own words, right? Not to blatantly copy from the passage. Deduce meaning of the words from context. This is it. There will be unfamiliar words like what Paul has told you. There will be, but if they are exposed to more text and if they know how to get the meaning from the context, this is what we have to teach them, right? So they should, if they see an unfamiliar word, they have to go back to the text and try to see how they can deduce the meaning of the text, of the word. Avoid including irrelevant information in the answer. avoid indiscriminate copying. And also, yes, another point is that, which of course I have not mentioned over here, is if they have to get an answer, a word from the passage, right? And if they write it incorrectly, they will not get the mark. They'll still get the mark if they write wrong English in open-ended. But if they copy it incorrectly, they're not going to get the mark. So they should be made aware of that, that if they're going to copy a word from the passage, it should be copied correctly. If the root word is given there, and if nothing has to be changed, it has to be copied correctly. Remind your students about this. Of course, they have, if we teach them systematically, they learn how to read between the lines, and they learn how to do figurative language. And also, again, something that I've not written down, put down on the PowerPoint is that they should also, from Form 4 onwards, of course, we start teaching them the different strategies. By the time they come to Form 5, by the second term, they should have a practice book, right? And examination skill or whatever. And then, of course, you will not have the time to make them do it in class under supervision. They will be doing it at home, right, on their own, because we do not have that much time. But tell them to time themselves, because they'll really be hard-pressed for time in the real exam. It's just 1 hour, 30 minutes, and then they have to do both the sections, right? And one more thing is that, please tell your students that before they enter the examination room, they should know clearly whether they want to do B1 or B2. They should not try to waste their time trying to look at both the sections and then decide. Because as you must be knowing, if your students are mediocre, and even if they do B2, it's fine, right? So it doesn't really matter. If they're mediocre students, encourage them to do B2, because at least they have a chance of getting level 5 and above. But if they're mediocre and if they do B1, they will be capped at level 4. So remind them about that as well. Next. Now, confidence boosting reminder to your students. The HKDSE is not a test of how successful they will be in life. Certainly not, right? It requires skills and techniques. They can learn the skills and techniques, all right? Yes, the paper is difficult, but it's not rocket science. You know, they can actually do it. They can work on their weak areas, but they can also build on their strengths. So practice, practice. Next. So, as Gandhi said, the future depends on what we do in the present. So if we guide them properly, they will be able to learn how to do this paper. So let's help our students to shoot for 5 stars. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a 25-minute tea break. But as well as the delicious food, there is a grammar exercise which Mr. John Duncan has very kindly prepared for you to fill out in preparation for his upcoming talk. Thank you very much. Enjoy the delicious dim sum. We have Mr. John Duncan, who will be talking about grammar form and grammar function. I will pass you over to him. Please welcome Mr. John Duncan.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. I'm freezing. Are you cold? I've been using my tea as a way of warming my hands. But now I've got the microphone. Very nice to see some familiar faces here. I'm going to talk just for about half an hour or a bit longer. The topic, as you know, is grammar form and grammar function. I think it's not going to be too hard, actually. The most difficult aspect is your homework, which you probably haven't done. But in front of you, you've got a little list of 20 questions, of which I think some, anyway, are correct. And I don't know if you've had a chance to find out which ones are correct or not. There's a hand up there. There are actually 5 correct answers there. And we're going to give you, as you leave, the answers. okay? So you can take it away, and if you think it's useful, you're very welcome to use it selectively with your own students. These particular questions, they're an example of grammar form. That is, they're focusing on the structure of grammar. You know, there's things like tenses or parts of speech, articles, that type of structural aspects of grammar. And when we talk about grammar, normally, that's what we talk about. And for my talk, I've called that grammar form. Form meaning the structure of the language, okay? Just before I move on to that, if you look at your little sheet for a second, for your information, the correct answers, the correct sentences, have you got it, are starting with the beginning, 3, 6, 8, 3, 6, 8, 11, and 18. So those are all correct. The one that might possibly be a problem for people is actually number 18. This is actually a correct answer. What it says there is, she asked me if I've been working hard, if I have been working hard. Now, this is, as we know, reported speech, and normally the rule is with reported speech that it goes 1 tense back in the past, right? So the basic rule that we teach the students at junior levels anyway is 1 step in the past. So actually what she said in direct speech for number 18 is, have you been working hard? Have you been working hard? And in reported speech, we teach our students, have goes to had, right? Goes 1 step back in the past. So the normal rule would be, she asked me if I had been working hard, okay? But actually, that rule is a bit flexible. And if you're talking, it depends on the context. And if you're talking about a context which is still current, i.e. we're still talking about the situation is still the same now, then we don't have to do this rule about going 1 step back into the past, okay? And in this incredibly interesting and exciting grammar book, there is a section on reported speech, and it explains that rule for your students, okay? And possibly for your teachers, but anyway, for your students. So that's one example. And in the answer sheet, which you can collect as you leave, it gives you the answers to all the other questions, but it also gives you the references in the book where you can find, the explanation in the book as to why this is incorrect. Okay? So quite a useful little book. Well, actually, not that little. Quite a useful, fairly big book. So this type of test is focusing on grammar form. And grammar form is what we start teaching. You know, it's the thing that we tend to focus on, possibly a bit too much, honestly, but it's the nuts and bolts of the language. You have to have some mastery of grammar form before you can do anything else. But it's not much good on its own. I mean, this type of exercise here doesn't really teach you anything. And it doesn't help you to write. It helps in the sense that it's like a diagnostic test at the doctor's. if you get it wrong, okay, so I don't know that rule, I better go and look up and find out what the rule should be, and hopefully I'll remember it next time. So it's quite good as a sort of test, but it's not really very helpful if you're going to write any continuous text, such as the exam requires for paper 2 and paper 3. Okay. In this book, actually, there is a section at the back which is all about diagnostic texts. So there's a whole list, I think it's unit 26, it's the last unit anyway, there's a whole list of discrete sentences like that, which you can try out on your students either at the beginning of the course to find out what they know and what they don't know, or more likely towards the end of the course when you want to find out what they still need to, or they maybe want to find out what they still need to revise before the exam comes up. So there's quite a useful little section right at the end, which is a sort of way of going back into the book in order to revise what still hasn't been learnt properly, okay? And it explains which units, if you got that sentence wrong, which unit you need to go to, okay, in the book. Right, moving on. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so we've been talking about grammar form, the structure of the language. Next slide, please. So here's some examples from the exercise we've just looked at. So these are the types of grammatical forms which are tested in those different sentences. You can look at that later. Next one, please. Okay, so as I've mentioned, grammar form is what we traditionally focus on. It's obviously extremely important to understand, for students to understand the grammar rules and to understand how they differ from the rules in Chinese. Massively, massively different. But, you know, it's obviously worth explaining, you know, about articles, for example, or parts of speech, and just being very clear about what the differences are, you know, make the students really understand the difference, not just try and learn the rule, but understand the differences. And of course, grammar accuracy is incredibly important for the two writing papers, paper 2 and paper 3. So nobody is arguing, don't teach grammar. Next, please. One of the significant things about grammar form is that if you make a mistake with your grammar, quite often it can lead to misunderstandings or ambiguity. So it's not just a question of, it's not correct, it doesn't sound right, but sometimes I don't understand what you mean. And there are a couple examples of that in that list. One of them is sentence 10, which is about describing a graph, something happening in a graph or a table. And the preposition there is incorrect. The answer, there's two possible answers. It could be to, or it could be by in question 10, okay? And the meaning of to and by are different because the to, the figure that follows after the to, will be the total after the change. And the by will tell you that the figure afterwards is the difference between the beginning and the end, but not the total, okay? So it's getting the right preposition is absolutely crucial because the meaning is completely different. And similarly, in question 17, there's a very common error which is to do with the difference between to be used to doing something, meaning to be accustomed to doing something, and used to do something, meaning I did it in the past, but I don't do it now. okay? And those two meanings are completely different, and if you kind of mix them up, then you have to make a check question or read around the context quite a lot to understand which of the two meanings is intended. Okay, so this is an example of how grammar form isn't just a question of, you know, it sounds right or it doesn't sound right. It does, you know, grammar form has to be accurate sometimes just because otherwise we don't really understand. It's ambiguous. One point to mention in a general sort of way is that accurate grammar isn't as important in everyday life, in speech, as it is in writing. I mean, it's an obvious point to make, but with speech, you've got a lot more contextual clues. You know more about what we're talking about because, we know what we're talking about because we're face to face, we can check. But with the writing, obviously grammar form is much more important because the other person can stop, can look at it, can notice that there's a mistake. It can be embarrassing, particularly if it's something official or formal. So correct form is far more important in writing than in speech, not just in the exam, but in life. Next one, please. Okay. This talks about form and also about function. Sometimes we talk about communicative function. This book is actually called A Communicative Grammar. Next one, please. Thank you. In those sentences, they're not only examples of grammatical mistakes in terms of form. They're also examples of what we call functions, communicative functions. Now, I may be telling you something that you all know, but just quickly, those sentences are examples of different functions, and there's a sort of list there. And it's a fairly obvious list. It's by no means complete. There are, I should think, about 40 different common functions, but those are the ones that I chose for this particular example, partly because they tend to pop up quite a lot in the writing exam. Students are quite often asked to do things like write an email making suggestions and giving reasons for your suggestion. Okay, so that's two functions there. Make the suggestion and give the reasons. In this year's paper, 2015 paper, there's a whole bit about bubble gum, the band bubble gum in paper 3. And one of the B2 tasks in paper 3 is a whole combination of those functions, one of which is persuading people to do things. Another one is making arrangements. I think that's there somewhere, is it? And another one is explaining rules and explaining consequences. So when we talk about this type of function, it's not just a sort of interesting way of looking grammar. It is actually very relevant to the examination and particularly the writing parts of it. Next one, please. Okay, so basically there are two reasons why we need to look at grammar from the functional direction as well as from the form direction. Next one, please. The first reason is that, generally speaking, there are exceptions, but most of the time, language is about communication. It's not just about words and grammar, it's about doing something with the language. You're trying to persuade people, you're trying to give your opinion, you're trying to disagree or agree, apologize, express your emotions like your regret or your relief. That's what we're doing with language. So it's important for your students and for yourselves, but mainly for your students, to think about what we use language for, and we use it for to express these different functions. And in the exam, it tests those functions. I'll come to that in a minute. Okay. Students need to understand the relationship between function and form. Certain language forms, grammatical forms, they have a functional use. And different forms, forms, which are called functional exponents, those forms can give you shades of meaning about the particular function. It's best to give you an example. So next one, please. Okay, reasons why we need variety of forms. The examiners are always complaining that students' writing lacks variation. You know, sentences are very short, vocabulary is very repetitive, there's not enough variety. And one of the reasons for learning more about functions is that you can say the same thing using lots of different types of phrase. So it's worth looking at the language, not just from the tenses and modals point of view, for example, but also from what you're trying to do, the functional point of view, because you can express the same function using lots of different grammatical forms. Okay, next one, please. To give one example, there's a function called regret. Oh dear. But when we look at these examples, you can express your regret in many different grammatical ways. As we can see here, you've got a third conditional sentence. If I had have worked harder, I wouldn't have failed. Okay, standard third conditional sentence. But you could express the same thing by saying, I wish. I wish I'd worked harder, then I wouldn't have failed. Or, if only I'd worked if only I'd worked harder, I wouldn't have failed. Now, all of these have got the past perfect in. They've all got had, okay? But you don't have to use the past perfect to express regret. For example, you can use the word regret. You know, I regret that I didn't work harder. No past perfect there, okay? Or, it was a mistake not to have worked harder. Getting a bit complicated here grammatically, but it's still expressing the same idea. Or, it's a major regret that I didn't work harder. So, this is quite complicated from your student's point of view. You're thinking to yourself, they don't need to know all this. But it is useful to be able to have at least 3 or 4 different ways to say one thing for the reasons of stylistic variation. Next one, please. Okay, a much more common and well-known function is suggestions, okay? And as we know, there are many different ways to make suggestions. We can talk about informal suggestions and formal suggestions. And these different grammatical examples express degrees of strength, okay? How strong is this suggestion? So at this, we could go to Lantau. That's just a sort of possibility. We could do that. What do you think? Like that. But if you get down to that at the bottom end, we should go to Lantau. It's still a suggestion, but it's a strong suggestion, okay? So the grammar is giving you shades of meaning to do with the functional exponent. And that's in the informal section. And there's also a formal section, okay? So this is more formal suggestions. This is between friends. This is maybe between colleagues at work or something like that. One idea would be to, okay, that's quite, we'd say, tentative. It's not that strong. But at the bottom, I think we should. That's really quite strong, okay? So it's useful to be able to have control of these different grammatical forms to all express the same function, which is suggestions, okay? And just being able to use one isn't really adequate because it's not a wide enough range. Next one, please. Okay, so I mentioned, I've been talking up until now about the fact that one function can be expressed through a lot of different grammatical forms. But the opposite is also true. It's also true that one grammatical form, the past perfect, can have many different functions, okay? So we're talking about the relationship between form and function and form, okay? So, for example, the most common use of the past perfect is the kind of 2 steps back in the past type meaning. And we've got an example there. Jane hadn't finished dressing when the front doorbell rang, okay? So front doorbell rang, but before that, Jane hadn't finished getting dressed, okay? Common use of the past perfect. We've already had the example of past perfect for reported speech, okay? Have goes to had, according to the rule. We also use it for cause and effect. There wouldn't have been any protests if the chief executive had agreed to see us, all right? There wouldn't have been any if he had agreed to see us. So that's a third conditional talking about cause, he didn't see us, effect, there were protests, okay? And regret, we've already mentioned regret, I wish I hadn't. And finally, the opposite of regret, relief, okay? That was lucky. If I hadn't stepped back, the car would have run me over, okay? So actually, regret and relief are sort of 2 sides of the same coin, okay? In one case, the thing that almost happened was a bad thing. I regret that it didn't happen. And the other side of it is the thing that didn't happen was lucky. It was lucky it didn't happen, okay? So the past perfect is being used to express 2 completely different concepts, almost opposite concepts, okay? Next, please. Okay, I mentioned that there's 2 good reasons for learning about functions. And the second one is much more practical. What we've been talking about now has been rather theoretical. In the exam, the papers focus on, particularly paper 3, but paper 2 and 3 really, they focus on communicative purpose, the tasks that the students have to do. The examiners really make an effort to make the tasks sort of realistic. I mean, obviously it can only be slightly realistic, but you know, they're making an effort. They're making an effort to provide a context for the task. So, for example, the students are usually given a situation. They're given a role, usually. You are the chairperson of something or other. And there's a reason for writing. There's a purpose, okay? And quite often, the writing tasks are phrased in terms of communicative function. For example, next, please. In the... that's not the next slide, is it? Can you go back one, please? All right, sorry, go on. Okay, all right, let's have a look at that, thank you. So this is an example from 2014, and you can see that we have a situation about school lockers. We've got a role, a chairperson. We've got a function, persuade, and you've got to give reasons as well. So that's a very typical question formation, and is expressed in terms of realistic functions. What do you have to do? In the 2015 paper, there's, you know, several examples of the same thing. A number of your classmates have expressed their disappointment about PE lessons at school, saying that the lessons are not interesting. Probably true. As the chairperson of the class association role, you have decided to reflect your classmates' opinions about this to your principal, Miss Chan. Write a letter to Miss Chan explaining why your classmates are unhappy, giving a reason. You should make suggestions about 2 activities and explain why they would be beneficial, okay? So that's an example from this year's paper last week, and it's exactly the same sort of format as we have here. And by coincidence, in this book, which I wrote, obviously not last week, in Unit 4 in this book, there is almost exactly the same task as a model. So, and I didn't write the exam paper this year, so it's worth thinking about functions because you might even, by accident, hit upon the same question. Next, please. Another example from last year's paper. Next, please. Okay. People often talk about writing, and they're thinking about paper 2. But paper 3, we had a discussion about this earlier, but paper 3 has its writing challenges as well, to say the least. I know that you're given the content, the students are given the content in the data file, and given very good instructions, usually in the second item in the data file, you know, the sort of instruction email, second item in the data file. So in some ways, it's not too bad. Students don't have to think about the content, except they've got to find it. And they know, so they don't have to think about that, and there's lots of information there. But the difficult part is trying to create the answer in terms of what you actually have to do, what the purpose of the thing is. So we quite often have persuading type tasks in paper 3. And apologizing is quite common. It even pops up, apologizing even popped up in the reading paper last year. Complaints of one sort or another, dealing with them, making them, they all come up. Arrangements, they're always coming up. So again, it's very useful to think in terms of functions when trying to teach writing for paper 3. Next, please. Right, now I've nearly finished. I'm just going to promote the book a little bit because this book is called A Communicative Grammar. And the reason is because it takes as its organizing structure, next please, primarily communicative function. So it starts from the idea of purpose. What's the point of it? Why are we writing about it? Okay? And what are we trying to do? And its secondary organization is to do with form. Okay, so the way it works in a typical unit is that, I should mention one other thing, that in terms of content of the material, it covers all 8 of the elective areas in the, paper 2. So, so in terms of vocabulary, you get input about poems and songs, debating, all of the areas, not in too much detail, but you do get vocabulary input about all of them. And sometimes that's useful, and sometimes it isn't. I mean, I noticed in last week's paper that the elective about debating wasn't about debating at all. You know, it was absolutely not about debating. It was actually, oh no, wait a minute, was it? No, the one about drama. The one about drama wasn't about drama. It was a short story. Okay, and the short story one wasn't a short story. The short story one was a letter or something like that. So, you do sometimes wonder what's the point of an elective when actually the questions aren't really about that elective. But anyhow, leaving that aside, in the book, I've covered the basic vocabulary of all 8 of the elective areas. I've really nearly finished. Next one, please. So this is how a typical unit is organised. Nishita talked earlier about the importance of contextualising new vocabulary. And what I've done in this is I've contextualised the grammar. So each unit starts with a passage. It could be lots of different types of text, as she mentioned. Could be a newspaper article, could be a letter, it could even be a piece of dialogue or a speech or something like that. So it starts with that, and sort of embedded, contextualized in that is the new grammar, okay? So students read the passage, usually 1 or 2 reading comprehension type questions on the passage, and then the grammar is extracted from the passage and explained in the usual way and practiced using traditional exercises in the sort of usual way. And then at the end, students go back into the communicative world by having a writing task which uses the functional grammar that they've been learning through the unit and sort of reusing it in a writing task which is a very typical either paper 2 or paper 3 writing task. And happily, from the teacher's point of view, in the teacher's book, there's model answers written by me, and so in terribly good English, and using all the grammatical forms that have come up in that unit. And there are also added exercises so that you can exploit the model answer, should you so wish, by extra questions about the model answer, which only you've got and they haven't. So you can use it how you like. I think that's probably all I need to say. Is that my last slide? Let's have a look. Next. Yes, I've already talked about that. Teacher's book. Aha, it is the last slide. And what's the time? 12:10. Definitely time to stop. As I said, those sentences, the answers, are on the way out. And you're very welcome to use them, exploit them, test your friends, embarrass your fellow teachers, anything like that. And just go away and have lunch and enjoy yourselves. Thank you very much.
Mr. John Duncan, co-author of Precise Communicative Grammar for HKDSE, the newly revised edition. Please, can you give a warm round of applause to our wonderful 3 guest speakers, Mr. Paul Pasquitz, Mrs. Nishita Prasad, and Mr. John Duncan. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a lovely Saturday, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.